Yeah, so Jason, welcome.
Hey Lou, thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, thank you. It'd really be great to get right in it, which
Yeah.
is, I think it's really good if you could share with people a bit of what brought you, what were the milestones of inspiration growing up that brought you into this field of work that you're so dedicated to today. It's a nice way for people to get to know you a bit.
Yeah, absolutely. So I grew up in the Pacific Northwest, just outside of Portland, Oregon, and spent a lot of my time growing up out in the woods and playing around creeks and just kind of naturally around the abundance of wildlife that is in the Pacific Northwest, and that includes a lot of fungi, especially during like the fall season. So they were just kind of always there in the backdrop for me. And as I grew older and was kind of trying to figure out my role and my place and what I consider to be by and large a pretty crazy society, I was really drawn to our plant allies and to kind of like the medicines of the earth and to see how they fit into my life. And I didn't really know what that meant at that time, but I started working with I kind of like overly relied on marijuana for a really long time and kind of abused that plant for a while. But I look at it as kind of like a gateway plant as well for my deeper healing and working with a lot of the other herbs and medicines and natural medicines that I work with, because it really kind of showed me the way that plants can and will engage with us, and that along with kind of like the other psychoactive plants and medicines are really present, and it's like they really make themselves known, whereas maybe some of the other herbs that are working more subtly, if you really pay attention, you'll notice how they work. But at that time, I think that was kind of like an entry level for me, being a young adult, a teenager, and um, had a really in-depth experience with mushrooms where I really kind of went into um, into the to nature, and I spent time, and it really kind of reoriented my perspective and my focus on seeing what nature really is and how the elements are moving, and the water and the earth and the air and the fire, and looking at everything in kind of like a more holistic perspective, which really, again, kind of like triggered something within myself that at that time I didn't really necessarily know or recognize. But it opened those kinds of doors of potential for me, in lack of a better term. And I was actively kind of looking for myself as like, okay, well, how do I exist in this society that's, by and large, very ill on multiple different levels, and there's this kind of like mass psychosis in the way that we relate to the natural world or don't relate to the natural world as a kind of like a collective. And how do I personally in my life fit in and kind of work with or through that? And I first kind of came by it through permaculture and looking at sort of natural models of working with the environment that are directly around us, and how do we kind of incorporate different sorts of food systems and community and things like that in order to sort of present an alternative paradigm to the larger paradigm that we're all kind of existing within. And while that was really fascinating at the beginning, it wasn't really the end of the path for me. And I really started getting more into herbalism and natural medicine and kind of looking at herbs. And for me, mushrooms were always at kind of like the forefront of that experience. And had some really engaging experiences at an event called the Radical Mycology Convergence, which was put on by now my good friend Peter McCoy. Him and I co-organized with one of our other friends the 2018 Radical Mycology Convergence. But it really opened the doors into the world of mycology and kind of all it had to offer in a much larger way. And at that time, I was delving more deeply into herbalism and natural medicine from a Western perspective, but also kind of primarily focused, especially through the processing lens, on the alchemical model, which is where that Spagyric processing and the term comes from. and then the mushrooms again were just kind of in the forefront of that experience. And so I was working with the herbs and learning about the herbs that are growing here in the Pacific Northwest. I spent some time in Hawaii where I was learning about the herbs and the ethnobotany and the natural medicine. And then just through the lens of alchemy, found kind of a deeper rooted meaning and how to see them more fully, and also how to work with them within a specific cosmology. So that's kind of like the super short and sweet of it. It's a kind of a, that question's always a tough one because it's really like a vortex, right? Is like I could point to an infinite number of synchronicities along the path that kind of led into these different experiences and led to where I'm at now. But that's kind of like the space I view.
That's great. So let's, I think it will be great if, at a time where certainly so many of our, those in our community, and I think broadly more people more conscious around plant medicine and plant health, they still don't really understand the supply, the way the crafts, the production, the craftsmanship. And since you have particular expertise in the extraction, I thought it might be great if you could do like a quick overview when you want to grow medicinal mushroom, right? The growing of medicinal mushrooms today, the lion's mane, turkey tail, the reishi, of which predominantly prior to the recent popularity, I think, so much of it came from China. Still, a lot of it comes from China.
Yeah.
Not to disparage China, but generally that product's hard to qualify in terms of quality, And so take us through the process of what happens.
Yeah. I mean,
great. I think a lot of people would appreciate just understanding that flow,
Totally. Yeah. And I think that kind of opens a door as well to what my relationship was to herbal medicine when I started studying and started working with it as well, because I was not setting out to create any sort of like commercial production or anything like that. That was not my background. That was not my goal. And so my background with working with and starting to learn about herbs was really allopathic, like pretty most people's experience when they learn about natural medicines or herbs is kind of like, oh, well, this herb, and then it's like, well, what's that herb good for? And it's good for headaches, and it's good for this, and it's a really kind of myopic and basic way at looking at herbs. And it's a great place to start. It's not to like knock it or anything like that, but that was kind of where it started. And I noticed to myself, it was like, oh, it's missing something. It's like there's a piece of this that's not really like being acknowledged. And at that time I didn't really know what it was or what it looked like. And so I kind of delved into, again, through those series of synchronicities, I came across this course in alchemy and spagyrics, and started working with my teacher in Marysville, Washington, by the name of Robert Bartlett, who's just this amazing, humble person who is just a wealth of information and knowledge, practical knowledge of alchemy. And to me, the biggest piece that kind of came into play with what I was already kind of gleaning from the realm of herbal wisdom was that there's like a cosmology at how we look at the natural world and how you work through the natural world. And there's like a philosophy that essentially guides the laboratory practice and the extraction process. And to me, that was like the missing piece, right? It was like, okay, well, yeah, there's herbs, but then there's also like those herbs have a spirit, and like those mushrooms have a spirit, and the minerals and the metals, everything that's coming from the earth has an essence and has a spirit. And when you recognize it as living, you look at it and you treat it in a different way than you would treat something that you consider to be dead or something that you can consider to be inanimate. And so
sets in, right? A certain
humility. Yeah, for right? Sure, a humility. And then there's like a guidance too, right? Because then from that alchemical perspective is like, you're not just blindly moving forward just to move forward. It's like there's like, okay, well, this thing is composed of these different components, and instead of just like well, how do we extract and isolate and get the most pure of this like one specific compound? You're like, oh no, well that's a whole bean. And if you can extract and then purify those different pieces and then keep it all together in the end, you can get this like beautiful picture of what that is. So that foundation really informed how I see natural medicine and how I see and work with herbs, and ultimately mushrooms. And then really kind of just followed through as I had this opportunity. So I own and operate a company called Feral Fungi, where we make medicinal extracts and out of different mushrooms, and we're helping with the Medicinal Mushroom Co's. And when I started that company, it was kind of like I was teaching on more of like the philosophical theoretical principles of what I call Mycology, which is also a chapter that I wrote in Peter McCoy's book, um, and looking at mushrooms and looking at fungi through the lens of traditional Hermetic alchemy. And I had an opportunity to teach at a conference, and I had a free booth at the conference. So I kind of had this like harebrained idea. I was like, oh, well, maybe I'll start a line of mushroom extracts, and just intended to sell them there. And then since then, it's really kind of exploded or blown up. And what I noticed from the very beginning is like, I feel like an outsider in that industry, because it's, going to the few kinds of like shows and things that I have gone to, is it's very trendy, and it's very much based on what herb is really popular and what's the next herb that's really popular. And as we're kind of seeing now, it's like mushrooms are really popular, and I just kind of, as you've known me for years now at this point, and I've been as enamored with mushrooms for the past 10, 12 years that I've known and been working with them. And so it's interesting to see this like wave happening. But with that, there's kind of like to my perspective, in a lot of the ways that nutritional and dietary supplements are produced, the spirit of the plants are oftentimes overlooked or forgotten, and people just kind of like leave that part of them behind, which also I think kind of affects the efficacy of what people or what companies are offering. And so I think, that's one part from more of like a subjective conjecture. But then there's also, like you're talking about these supply chain questions and issues. And it's like, with mushrooms, a lot of products that are on the market aren't even actually mushrooms. It's the mycelium grown on grains. So the mycelium, for maybe some people who aren't aware, is like the subterranean body of the fungi. And then what the mushroom is the reproductive organ of the fungi. And it's kind of what you would recognize as a mushroom if you go to the store and you buy like button mushrooms, or if if you've seen a mushroom and that kind of archetypal mushroom shape, that's the mushroom or the fruit body. And most products are mycelium grown on grain. And there's been some promising research in the benefits of mycelium, but there's been absolutely no research that I've seen that indicates how that's affected when it's grown on grain. And mycelium only grows one cell wall thick. It's pretty like a thin material. So even when you get like a fully colonized block of grain, it's still a lot of grain and still a lot of undigested material, essentially. So there's kind of, questions.
But so is it your ethos, your thesis that the growing of it as a fruiting body, that's the alternative way of growing that? Is that a more complex, more involved process that you would, do you qualify that as, making a fine Cabernet versus a table wine kind of, is it of that nature?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, it might even be closer, if in an analogy like that, to like a crude like malt liquor versus like a finely
Sure,
distilled.
sure. Yeah,
So
yeah.
basically, yeah, when you get the fruit body, what you're getting is this complex. It's often in nature is short lived, but that's what for thousands of years we've traditionally used in various different systems of medicine, including Chinese medicine and um, so the fruit body is kind of like what has been anecdotally tested and used throughout history. And I think about it in the context of like when you find mycelium in the forest, it's like these little thin strands of mycelium is like you're not going to go through and split that out. So it's only very recently that we've even been able to work with mycelium.
I see.
And then I think there's some benefits to the mycelium, but again, I think there's not as much known. And I think when you work with and get the fruit body of the mushroom, you're getting a pure, unadulterated extract of the mushroom. It's much more rich in the triterpenes and the sesquiterpenes and pure beta glucans. You're not going to get any alpha glucans that oftentimes come from the grains. So I see it as kind of like, I think most people at this point are kind of on board with it being sort of like an industry shortcut, because you can grow a lot of different mushroom mycelium in the same sort of grow conditions. And it's really easy to grow that mycelium out, and it takes a really short period of time. But for something like reishi, for example, if you're going to grow the mycelium and then you're going to get it all the way to fruit, that's going to take 3 to 4 months to potentially longer, depending on parameters and your preference. And so it's like it's a lot easier to just pump out, and really cheap too, to pump out, you know, hundreds and thousands of pounds of like grain essentially that are just inoculated with mycelium. It's basically like fermented with mycelium. And again, I think there's a benefit to that too. I just think it gets kind of obfuscated in the picture of what you're actually getting. And then it's kind of confusing because with the information about the medicinal mushrooms and how they benefit and what's working, and all the scientific literature is pointing at compounds that are patently concentrated in the fruit body, and maybe talking about things that are coming from mycelium, but oftentimes it's mycelium, pure mycelium that's like grown in a liquid broth, and then it's extracted with, you know, really intense, highly volatile chemicals, and then they're using a like a pure extract of that, which is very different than say the ground mycelium powder that you're going to get at the store. Again, which will have its benefits, but when you're talking about how mushrooms can potentially be helping people and the types of chronic illnesses that they have the potential to kind of remedy, it's like you're not going to get nearly enough of the, you know, the beneficial um, compounds that you will from a pure fruit body.
Yeah, if nothing else out of the talk tonight, this is probably, you know, one of the more profound, because, you know, we also in the fungi, and, you know, you go back in time, herbs, and not enough research is being done.
Yeah.
So we're brought up always to be quite guarded, not making claims, right, in the herbal
Yeah.
industry, if we're conscious and responsible. But then you go into this process of the farming and the growing and the extraction. Just that alone, if people will embrace the idea of the fruiting body, that if you go to a place, ask about that,
Yeah.
encourage that, not to disparage any of the benefits. Mushrooms come up in lots of different ways, but in this, particularly for the interest in microdosing, more punch, more direct opportunity to heal and help. This is a very good takeaway for people. It's really very not understood. So
Yeah.
then that leads to the next stage, right? Which is, would extraction then be the next stage? The mushrooms are cultivated in this way, so perhaps you could take us to the next stage a bit of what in your practice, you know,
Yeah,
to the
definitely.
commercial practice. Yeah.
Yeah, so beyond just working with the fruit body, we're also, as you know, and part of the reason why, you know, Fifth Kingdom and you guys decided to work with us was because we are also focused on hyper local sourcing of our mushrooms, because I think that's kind of another issue that gets overlooked, as you kind of touched on, is
Yeah.
most of the biomass of mushroom material is being imported from China, and they've had their systems in place for a lot longer. They know what they're doing in growing medicinal mushrooms. But I always kind of look at that, especially in terms of manufacturing, and it's like, okay, well, what are, like, there's other costs associated with it. So even if the quality is the highest quality possible, the only excuse that I've heard that people don't look more locally is because you'll never get it for as cheap as you get it from China. And it's like there's a reason that that's happening. And oftentimes, again, I don't know specifically, and I'm not going to call out any companies or practices, but oftentimes that's related to, you know, industry regulations and labor laws and things like that that are often implemented over here that are not implemented in different places overseas.
Yeah,
So I think,
just the movement alone, you know, of transport.
yeah,
I think our shared message there is opens up more potential for pollution
for
or
sure.
lack of efficacy. It opens up more opportunities versus, you know, keeping it local
Ex-
when possible.
Exactly. And that's the biggest question for me is like, well, yeah, it's cheaper to you and out of pocket it's cheaper, but what is the greater cost? And I feel like oftentimes there's a greater cost associated with us getting products and things for cheaper. And that goes for almost any industry that we look at. But so we work, and at this point we source all of our mushrooms primarily in the Pacific Northwest, but you know, we have like our cordyceps growers out in Pennsylvania, and we work with all US grown mushrooms. And then again, kind of the piece that I left out of that last bit, but we touched on a little bit earlier, is that we look at the whole mushroom when we're working with them, especially at this point, is like we're so early in our understanding of, you know, beneficial mushrooms and what the beneficial compounds are and how those things are acting. And I kind of, you know, make it akin to something that a lot more people are familiar with at this point, which would be like hemp or CBD. And it's like we kind of went through this process with those things where we went through this kind of process where we were like, oh yeah, it's CBD, that's the isolated compound, that's the purest one, we get that isolated, and then we find out that it's like not quite as effective on its own as it is with the rest of these kind of compounds that are naturally occurring in the hemp or the cannabis plants. And so I make that analogy because I feel like a lot more people at this point are more familiar with hemp or with CBD. And um, there's something similar happening with mushrooms too. And it's kind of like, again, this really myopic perspective. It's like, oh, well, the hericenones and lion's mane are what's making it really good for the nervous system, or the cordycepin and cordyceps is all the value of cordyceps. And for me, it's like, well, yeah, that can tell you some really good information, especially in the context of scientific literature. But there's also so much more going on than we really know about, especially at this point. So I think the safest route at this point is looking at them more holistically. So all of our extracts, we start with raw US grown mushrooms, dried in whole form, so we can actually look at them and verify what the mushrooms are. So a lot of places will grind up it in powder. Um, and then we take those whole mushrooms, we grind them ourselves, and then we are extracting with organic cane alcohol. And then we're extracting with hot water and extracting with these two very polar opposite, quite literally, menstruums. You're able to get this variety of compounds out of the mushrooms, which is really necessary for the mushrooms. So a lot of times with herbs, it's really safe to like settle on a set percentage of alcohol, and between the percentage of alcohol and water, you'll pull kind of like the desired compounds that you're looking for out of the herbs. But with the mushrooms, you really need to do the high percentage alcohol and then the pure water, because the polarity of the compounds available in the mushrooms are so different. So primarily with the water, you're pulling polysaccharides, or what are, you know, often beta glucans from the mushrooms. And that's all mushrooms contain beta glucans, and it's just bound up in their cellular structure. So they're known as a primary metabolite, because all mushrooms have these kind of long chain sugars that make up the chitin that are bound in the chitin of the cell wall, right? And so hot water is really necessary to break down and extract the long chain sugars from that mushroom. And then the alcohol is going to be pulling a lot more volatile compounds from the mushrooms. A lot of times it's going to be like terpenes and different sets of types of acids, which are often terpenes as well. And those things are going to kind of have their own subset of beneficial properties.
Pepsi and Pepto get there.
as well. So we do that dual extraction, and then what really sets our extraction process apart is at the end, when most people just kind of take the mushroom that's been extracted and then they'll just kind of discard it, or they'll remove and throw away the mark. We take that mark and we burn it into a really fine ash, and then we leach the pure mineral salts from the ashes, and then we recrystallize those mineral salts and we put them all back together to form what is known at that point as a spagyric tincture. So it's really the addition of the body of the mushroom in its most pure form that we put it all back together. And it's a complex, on a physiological level, it's a complex of mineral salts. On a more esoteric philosophical level, it's philosophically the body of the mushroom. And so you think about it in the larger context of, now it's like you've got the body of the mushroom, and you think of how we have physical bodies that we're trying to treat with these different herbs and these mushrooms, and now with the mushroom being re-embodied essentially through those mineral salts, they know where to go and how to move through the body. And then again, there's kind of like physiological uh, representations of that, and just how the cell salts and the mineral salts help with the uptake of various different compounds also available in the mushroom. So again, we're looking at our extraction process through more of a holistic lens, and we're taking what is essentially just, from a myopic perspective, breaking down these compounds into the water and the alcohol, and then taking it, we have all the parts that were initially there in those mushrooms. They've just been extracted and refined, and then all of them are still there. So we really look at it as a living medicine, because nothing has really been lost in the process of
That's a really great takeaway. So then the salts, right? The mineral salts, which are the agent for the body of the mushroom to be reinfused, right? Put back into the tincture, right? The
right.
formulation.
Mm-hmm.
Is what you're saying is that in addition to the sense of spirit, right, and completion and
Mm-hmm.
wholeness, that are you saying that the salts, once they're ingested into the body, saturate better or reach different parts of the body more? Is it, does it actually work biologically? Where those salts are being distributed differently than perhaps if they're not being put back in the body, they wouldn't be there. But I'm just curious. That's very curious to me that there may, and we understand that there may not be all of the research done, but
Yeah.
the implication or the
Yeah.
thesis, which is, I think we want people to realize this is about a thesis. This is
Yeah.
a point of view. So
Yeah.
maybe, but just elaborate a touch on that if I would really love to hear that.
For sure. Yeah. So I think anecdotally that would be, and from a theoretic perspective, that's exactly what's happening. um I think for myself and many of the other people that I know who are in the realm of working with and making spagyrics, I think that that's a big question of why are they more effective, because it's anecdotally, over and over again, you hear that it's like more effective, and oftentimes you can taste it, it's a lot stronger, it's a lot more forward in the taste of the herb. And I think that it's a complex question,
Like more
but
sensual. I always use the word. I feel like it's almost more sensual in a way. It's like
yeah,
rich.
yeah,
More enriched
for
in
sure.
taste. I'm saying in taste, certainly in your output.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah. So there's not really like direct evidence that you can say like, oh, well, we've, delivered mushroom compounds with minerals, such as potassium and sodium, and we found these results. You can kind of like infer things from different research that's been done, that's out there. And so like we know with like trace minerals, for example, that those trace minerals are really necessary for our body to operate properly, and that oftentimes they're really helpful for our cells to uptake different kinds of compounds and to be more hydrated. And so there's that aspect. So it's basically like a little shot of trace minerals in your tincture, but they're trace minerals that are inherent in the mushrooms. that you're working with, or
Good.
the herbs that you're working with as well.
I have a question from Suzanne. She's saying, do you use hot water or warm water, or how is water used
Yeah.
in your process? If you could address that, because we'll start to try to take some questions. Really encourage you guys, please feel comfortable to share any questions. We'll try to field them.
Yeah, no question. No question is a dumb question. I always think if it helps you in your understanding or anything, don't feel ashamed or anything of anything you have to ask. But yeah, it's always hot water. So you know, that's another issue of kind of some things that I've seen, especially at like farmers markets and stuff, is like growers will just take the mushrooms and then grind them into a powder and then sell them as like a mushroom powder. And it's technically a mushroom powder, but the cell wall of the mushrooms being so hard and made of chitin, like I mentioned before, it's like our fingernails or like a crustacean. It's like our bodies don't produce chitinase, which is the enzyme necessary to break down chitin. So our bodies can't break that down and access all the good nutrients that are available in there. That's why you also just never eat raw mushrooms, because there's literally no point. Like the mushrooms that you would maybe at a salad bar, I mean, those are at this point probably a thing of the past, but at like a salad bar where you get like the little button mushrooms and maybe you'll cut up some fresh mushrooms and put them on your salad, it's like you don't really get any benefit from that nutritionally, because your body doesn't have the enzymes necessary to break down the cell wall of the mushroom. So we always use hot water, and our extraction process goes for quite a while, but it's generally kind of assume that you need to do at least 2 hours in boiling water. That's kind of like my baseline, is like a 2 to 3 hours in boiling water cook of the mushrooms to be able to break down that cell wall and then make the polysaccharides are kind of the primary thing that are going to be pulled with the water, but you're going to get a lot of other things as well. But hot water. Oh, I think you're muted still there, Lou.
Yeah, and before I go to the next question, Suzanne had also asked earlier, is really what is in this time we're living in, what is really the true cost of the entire supply chain? And I think that is really relevant, because the less movement, should never compromise quality, but even so, the less movement, hyper local becomes even more interesting. It's not just the novelty of the
Yeah.
natural foods movement, go to
Yeah.
the farmer's market and buy what's local. It
Right.
actually is a more profound choice
Yeah.
that I think as conscious consumers, we're being asked to ask that question, because it
Yeah.
certainly looks like an awful lot of stuff has to move a long distance. And it's a big wake up call. It's such a paradox in a time of trying to be more awakened to the perils of climate.
Yeah. And I mean, a huge wake up call when we actually see the limitations of our supply chain, as we're kind of seeing in this day and age, where hundreds, if not thousands, of boats can't even get into the ports and deliver those things. So again, it like makes you value again on all these different levels of like, who am I supporting with my dollar? And again, it's like, do we keep our money within our local economy, which is going to feed somebody else down the street, and then it's going to feed somebody else around the corner, and it's like all staying and nourishing and nurturing the local community? Or are we going to send it all overseas and nurture somebody else's community as well? And I know it's not quite that simple, but
the mycologists, many of them, the mycologists, so many actually that we know, forest folk, Catskill fungi upstate,
yeah,
they're actually going out and foraging for the mushrooms.
yeah, for sure.
So so when they run out and they say sorry,
Yeah,
and you have to be respectful these days of scarcity,
yeah,
because they're trying to stay within certain boundaries,
for sure.
so it's a really heightened awareness, particularly to, I think, a terrific community of mycologists that are emerging in this country, which is, younger people talented as such as yourself, and quite a groundswell, I think, of good minds, right?
Yeah.
That are going into the community of growing and discussing and extracting. So,
Yeah.
I don't think you're alone, right, in
No,
this
definitely not.
venture, in this period,
Yeah.
Let me stay with the questions. From Michael, I understand that the Chinese use tincture much less in the West. Instead, they use powder. Is this true with herbs than powder? True. Second, why not simply eat mushrooms? Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's a good question. Thank you, Michael.
Yeah. So, there's a couple different layers to that. I think in response to your second question first of why not simply eat mushrooms, um, I, I think eating mushrooms is a really awesome way of getting the benefits out of the mushrooms. However, when you got mushrooms, they've got such a short shelf life before you can use them, and then they're they're going to disintegrate, or they're going to get moldy, or they're going to just not be good anymore. And so to keep them available and accessible for their medicinal compounds, it's really good to be able to dry them and then to extract them in some way, because then that's going to preserve them even further. Also, when you eat something, like when you eat herbs, or when you eat food or mushrooms in the form of like food, it has to be digested and metabolized through the body before your body can really glean any of those nutrients from it. So a lot of times, often concentrated extracts, when they're used for their medicinal virtues, are going to be much more bioavailable to the body, just because you're getting it in the pure form. And especially when something's like carried in something like alcohol, it's going to be much more readily absorbed through the mucous membranes and into the bloodstream, and be more accessible for your metabolic system to process, versus having to be processed through the liver. So definitely, Chinese use a lot more powdered herbs and mushrooms than tinctures. I am not a Chinese herbalist, so I don't know exactly, what the ethic or the reason is behind that. From my
Tea, I
perspective,
think tea.
tea for sure.
I think
Yeah,
the tea as a carrier. I'm sorry to
yeah.
interrupt, but the
No,
tea
no, that's okay.
carrier, I think it became a very convenient way to store it, to
Yeah,
to to dose it. That's my understanding. Again,
yeah. And drawing from their traditional systems too, right? It's like much easier to have access to a dried herb that you can then powder and then have on hand, that could then be, like Lou said, be used as a tea, or made into like a medicine that could be taken directly as like a powder. Um, so I think, that's probably the primary reason. And then, from my background and understanding and way of looking at it as well, is like once an herb or mushroom is taken out of its sort of like taproot of the natural environment, whether it's like disconnected from the roots or pulled from the ground, it starts to lose its vitality, or in the terms of the alchemist, you might say it's like giving up the ghost. And so it starts to lose vitality. And while it has the three principles from the alchemical perspective that sort of give it life and essence, it starts to kind of dwindle in those, until it essentially just gives itself back to the earth, right? And so the theoretically is like, the fresher that you're able to process something, the more high quality your extract is going to be, because you're kind of like maintaining the vitality of that herb or of that mushroom through that alchemical perspective. And then especially if you're using like a tincture or something, because rather than degrading really readily over time, it's more often than not going to age like a fine wine or something, where it's just going to get kind of like more nuance, as long as it's not exposed to really intense heat or direct sunlight for really long periods of time. And even so, it's like it's still going to be better than like a dried herb sitting on the shelf. And then the other thing, especially when it comes to mushrooms, that I found is that when you do a dual extraction on the mushrooms, then we know that the alcohol is pulling a whole wide array of compounds and the water's pulling really important compounds. Now, most of those powdered extracts that are coming from China are spray dried. So what they're doing is doing hot water extraction on the mushrooms. And then at a really high temperature, they're atomizing the water and using oftentimes like nitrogen, and they're like flash drying the atomized tea basically, and then it's turning into a powder. Now, when you extract it with alcohol, it's really thick and it's really oily, and that oil has a lot of the, especially the volatile compounds, but you can't dry that as easily.
Can you
So
freeze it? Can you freeze mushrooms to
like
preserve?
like freeze dry them.
Yeah, can you, it's a question, can freezing the tincture keep the mushroom fresh?
Yeah, well, if the
In a
alcohol
tincture,
content,
in a tincture form was the question.
yeah, if the alcohol content is above 25%, there's not really any need to freeze it. But if you were to make like tea, like a really strong tea that you're, again, if you were listening earlier, boiling for more than 2 hours to properly extract it, you could put it into like an ice cube tray or put it into bags, and you could freeze it and you could preserve your tea that way over long periods of time if you weren't for some reason able to use or work with alcohol. That's a really good way to do it.
The Michael also was just curious, can spagyrics be grown on logs in oats or other environments? Is the quality of the spagyric tincture greater one way or another in terms of that source?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, I think that's just kind of like a general question in terms of natural medicine. I always think that there's a little bit more natural vitality in something that's grown in the wild and its natural elements and with its kind of natural growth opportunities. However, with that being said, I think you also, because most of the mushrooms that we work with are actually cultivated, and a big reason for that is because just kind of touching on what you were saying earlier, Lou, about just when you can't find any more mushrooms in the wild, they're just not available. And then there's also kind of a bigger question of like sustainability of maintaining stands and making sure people aren't over harvesting certain areas, and making sure that they're tending stands of mushrooms and herbs really responsibly. And those things are all hard to track. So there's kind of like, for me, a peace of mind, especially as we started to grow, of being like, okay, well, it'd be nice to know that the supply is there. Also, it'd be nice to know that we're able to do it in more of a sustainable way.
Yeah, and
So
it's consistent. Also, you get more consistency, right, out of
yeah,
growing. Yeah.
yeah, and there's also, and that's also kind of like a piece of where the name feral fungi even came from, right? Is because mushrooms are like the mushrooms that we cultivate in more of a sterile setting are still connected to the first mycelium that was drawn out of the natural environment. And so they still have that feral edge to them where, as much as we run them through agar and put them into grains and run them out in these kind of more human coerced environments, they still are kind of intrinsically tapped into that feral nature of themselves, which is kind of where that name came from. Is like, well, even working within that way, that's part of the reason that name came to be.
A good question I'd like to ask you, because is the there has been a DIY movement, right? Mushrooms, I could grow that myself.
Mm-hmm.
I'm gonna go online, buy some spores.
Mm-hmm.
And then we've seen some companies develop that sell kits, right? And
Yep.
you can buy the mushrooms and get the kits. And I personally, I've always imagined, the alchemist kitchen. I can't wait till I could sell the appliances, for the next generation of kitchen.
Yeah.
Because, why shouldn't people be able to just grow them on, use technology, use science, and be able to have that become a part of the future kitchen,
Yeah.
So how do you see that aspect of the DIY and kits and and that process that I think also leads to this supply chain. And is it, do you envision that we could reach a place where people could do more of that for their family at home?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I'm all about empowering individuals to do their own things. Like I speak pretty openly about our process and stuff too, even though it took me a long time to kind of come by it and to learn how to do it and to figure it all out, because there wasn't really like a clear pathway to understanding it. But my whole perspective is like, well, we are doing our best to help each other become more self-reliant, and we're collectively doing that, right? So it's like we're collectively working and uplifting the community and trying to make these things more accessible. And I think any way that we can have that relationship with the things that we're ingesting, either for medicine or for food or oftentimes for both, the better it is for our hearts and for our minds and for our spirits, because those are things that, kind of going back to the beginning of what we were talking about, it's like those are things that we're disconnected from, that a lot of people are disconnected from. That's where like a lot of people are stemming in depression from, and anxiety and hardship in a lot of different ways, is just because they're not living in any sort of harmony with with
So
other living things. And so I think that bringing that back in, and then there's also this aspect of like, I just feel like on a deeper, more intuitive level that the mushrooms are really doing something right now. And it's like, I don't know what exactly their roadmap is or their game plan, but it's like, it's pretty profound, like how quickly people are becoming fascinated and interested in mushrooms and how quickly that industry is growing. And so I also just kind of trust the spirit of fungi in general, and the kind of like the route that they're
well,
moving on.
we're feeling, I think we're feeling disenchanted, and we feel numbed, by the overwhelming existential threat that most people are becoming acquainted with. And
Yeah.
somehow, as Merlin Sheldrake, he often says, the mushrooms are there to help us solve the problem. You have to show up with gratitude and humility and respect and listen to the mushrooms.
Yeah.
Eat the mushrooms, take the mushrooms, become and follow that, because most of the people you will meet are good people and will
Yeah.
be a good part of your community in a true sense of community. I want to just keep a couple of, so a couple of people are asking, about this issue of the alcohol in the extraction,
Mhm.
and particularly people sensitive to alcohol. And maybe you could talk to the merits of it, and are there alternative extraction possibilities?
Yeah,
Um, that will be, I think a couple of people are really interested in that.
for sure.
Yeah.
Yeah, so and I see Michael's question there too about putting the herbal tinctures in a little bit of hot water to
Yeah.
help the alcohol evaporate. And honestly, that's a great way to do it. I mean, the amount of alcohol that you get in a dropper of tincture is essentially the amount of alcohol you get in like an overripe banana, is just concentrated. And so you're not ever going to take too much, but for various different reasons it's hard for people to do that, or maybe they have health concerns that prevent them from taking it as well. And so yeah, I think it's a complex issue, because you can definitely get away with doing hot water extracts and you can still have a viable kind of extraction process. Is it going to be, the most full spectrum? No, but it still can work, and it can work for your purposes. So I think you just kind of have to find what works in your kind of scope of what you need for yourself. I mean, for us personally, we're working on developing different ways where we're doing that process, and then we're removing the alcohol out of it, and then making, various different forms of that available um, for people, because I think that, one level of it is making really effective extracts. The other level of it is, having compliance with the people who want or need to take those extracts. So, beyond just like concentrated, really heavy hitting alcohol based tinctures, it's like we also offer like you know, lion's mane maple syrup that we're doing that same extraction process, and then we're concentrating all the alcohol and water out, and then we're mixing it with a syrup, which is something sweet, and you know, you
And
can,
very flavorful, you know.
yeah, very flavorful, yeah,
Because a lot with mushroom, you know, the alcohol is one piece, but making these tinctures, you know, in their own way taste delicious, you know,
yeah,
and is an art, you know, and a science, because not so easy, you know. And so that's
yeah.
another piece, the alcohol, the sugar. So it's fascinating, right, that we're able to at least be having an awareness that we're trying to minimize our exposure to these things, you know.
Yeah, and we look at, and you know, from the alchemical perspective, right? You know, we get that term spirits, and we talk about alcohol, and alcohol as being the spirit of the plant, is because that comes from the tradition of Hermetic alchemy, where you have the mercury of the philosophical mercury of the plants, which is the spirit of the plants, which is anytime that you ferment and then distill plant material, you're oftentimes going to yield some amount of ethanol. And so ethanol is this kind of like universal spirit of the plant realm, which is also why it's such a good menstruum for plants primarily, but it also works really well for mushrooms as well. Now you can use other solvents as well that are a lot more questionable in their sourcing and kind of how clean you can leave the extracts. It's kind of similar to cannabis in that way. And you can pull kind of like different subsets of compounds that way as well. But the biggest thing is then at the end, you have to get that out of there. And then I see in here too that somebody's asking about the vegetable glycerin version of extracts. The only ones that I've really seen on the market with mushrooms, so you can't effectively extract mushrooms with glycerin. It's just something that people are adding afterwards. And the only ones that I've seen are people adding vegetable glycerin to like the Chinese powders mixed with water. And so I think that the ones that I've seen, you know, there might be some out there that I'm not aware of, but the ones that I've seen are kind of like the lowest of the low, bottom of the barrel type of not even doing the extraction. They're just kind of mixing pre-extracted, and you're getting virtually nothing for what you're paying for. And what I've seen in some of those types of extracts. I don't personally like working with glycerin just because it's also sort of like it's a, you know, byproduct of a different process, and it's not always necessarily the most clean. But we've also looked at and considered like, well, if we want to offer an alcohol free version of a tincture as well, and again, we'd probably look at something similar of concentrating our tinctures and then replacing the alcohol with something else that would stabilize it. Glycerin is an option, even though for some reason I'm um, very resistant to glycerin. I don't know exactly what
Oh,
it
no, no,
is.
it's true. We run into that like with stevia and sugar, you know, and then
Yeah,
start using stevia, and then it's just not quite sugar. You know,
yeah,
you
yeah.
know what I mean? So yeah, it's really good. Well, you know, I can't believe we're almost at the end of an hour,
I know.
but you know, look, I just want to wish everyone, really encourage you to learn more about Spagyrics. You can learn more on the Alchemist Kitchen site. You could go visit Jason's site, feralfungi.com, and we'll put that also in the in the chat. And we really appreciate it. You know, really, I can't. You know, as we head into the holiday season, we offering these Spagyrics. You know, there's one Clarity, really great. You know, great response over the last couple of months, and Harmony, Reishi, and Clarity with Lion's Mane, and we have some Immunity and Joy, and they're all really good examples of this movement to the very concentrated, good punch. You can take it all day or morning or night, and you know, just use this conversation to embrace the power of the fungi and the power of plants. And hopefully over this next year or so, we'll even see more research and more innovations, and I'd love to be the first one to have some good appliances that, and replace the Sub-Zero with the next generation of growing mushrooms. But
Yeah, and just a quick
you.
note on that.
Yeah, please.
With the tinctures for Medicinal Mushroom Co. It's like I had a really good time working with the team from the Medicinal Mushroom Co. to develop those formulas because they really listened to me, which I appreciated, of just really working with really strong herbs and then trying to flavor it without adding like flavors, but working with like the natural herbs and then balancing the energetic constitution of those formulas with those herbs as well. So it was like we made those formulas not only just like it wasn't just like, oh, well, this is good for immune system and this is good for the immune system and this is good for immune system. We also looked at, well, okay, well, what are the energetics of that herb? Is it hot? Is it dry? Is it, wet? Is it cold? And based on kind of the herbal energetics as well, we balance those formulas really well. So they are safe for people to take for long periods of time, or you can take them like more specifically for more chronic instances of things that you're going through. But we put a lot of thought and intention into that, and they are definitely strong tasting. But I also, always think about it in the context of like, you don't really complain about the pills that the doctor gives you for your health because of the taste. It's like oftentimes we expect something different from herbs, but that's not always the intention when you're trying to make something really effective. So
you can use Alchemy 25 at checkout. Come visit us in Soho. Jason, my best to you and the family. Will be in touch soon. Looking forward to working with you next year as well.
Yeah, you as well. Thank you so much, Lou. Thank you everybody for joining us.
Yeah, thank you so much. We appreciate you so much. Have a great rest of your night, guys. Thank you.